You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the Unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We're joined today by author Robert Kolker, here to talk about his New York Times best-selling book, Lost Girls, An Unsolved American Mystery. Bob, thank you so much for joining us on Mind Over Murder today.
It's great to talk with you both. Thank you.
Go ahead and start off by telling us a little bit about your professional and educational background.
I grew up in Maryland and went to college in New York and stayed there. I've been a New Yorker for over 30 years. I've been a journalist for 30 years, mostly in magazines. More than half that time, I was a staff writer at New York Magazine, writing feature stories and cover stories, a lot of crime stories, a lot of narrative stories about complicated subjects. Lost Girls actually evolved from a cover story about the Long Island serial killer case that I wrote back in 2011. Then the book came out in 2013. Since then, I've written another book, Hidden Valley Road, that was a #1 bestseller and an Oprah book. And I like to go back and forth between magazine stories and books. It's a dream career. So I'm very grateful to be able to do it.
When we talk about Lost Girls, the book, and this case, where do you find yourself coming down in terms of referring to this case by name? Are you going with Gilgo Beach, or are you going with Long Island serial killer?
It's the most amazing thing. The entire time I wrote the book, people were saying Long Island serial killer. I called it the Long Island serial killer. Then shortly after the book was published, people started to shorten it and call it LISK. There's a fine documentary series called The Killing Season with some nice people who run it. And it's all LISK, LISK, LISK. And that was interesting. And then the second this arrest happens, it's the Gilgo Beach murders and the Gilgo Beach killer, which I hadn't seen in such high circulation before. So I'm happy to go where the wind blows and go with Gilgo Beach killer at this point.
We had noticed the same thing because people refer to it as Long Island serial killer, and we know people that have written about it and covered the case on podcasts. And then with the arrest, we find ourselves stumbling to describe the series of murders accurately. Now people are almost talking about them as if they're separate events. We've got four women who have been at least potentially linked to Rex Heuermann, and they're being referred to as the Gilgo Beach Four. It's almost like Long Island serial killer or LISK is a separate case. Any thoughts on that?
Those 4 sets of remains were always set apart from the others. They were very particular compared to the others that were found. But there was a constant debate about whether they should be a separate case or not, or whether it's all potentially one killer. In fact, there was a huge breakdown from the very beginning between the police commissioner at the time and the district attorney at the time about whether there was one killer or more than one killer. And that was one of the first reasons why the case entered paralysis, in my opinion. But it interests me now that there's an arrest that this becomes the Gilgo Beach killer, and these other murders are off in the ether, and it's anyone's guess whether they will be tied to. It's a tough one because you have so many other victims to account for, some of whom have been identified and some of whom still have not, which is just stunning to me that someone in New York City could be unidentified in a murder case like this for 10 years. It's interesting to think that we need to be that specific with our killers because there are so many of them. Mm-hmm. And certainly there is more than one Long Island serial killer. There was Joel Rifkin from another generation who is far more prolific than it appears Rex Heuermann was. So if you want to get scholarly about it, maybe it makes sense to be more specific with your titles.
How did the Gilgo Beach cases actually come onto your radar?
I was on staff at New York Magazine. I lived in Brooklyn. I had a car, which meant that it was pretty easy for me to get out to Long Island. I had done some Long Island stories in the past before this that were crime stories. And when those first 4 remains, when the Gilgo 4 were found in December 2010, my editor turned to me and said, "This looks like it's for you." And I resisted. I was probably intimidated by such a competitive story because it was already national news. But also I was jaded and I was skeptical. I thought they're going to solve this case in 24 hours. Just a year and a half earlier, there had been a Craigslist killer in New England who murdered one person, and the police found him within 48 hours. So I thought, 4 people who the police say are sex workers, that's 4 digital trails from Craigslist. They're going to find this guy before I even get in my car. But also I had, that wasn't the only incorrect assumption I made. I also was dead wrong about something else, which was when I learned that these 4 women were supposedly escorts, I thought we're never going to learn a thing about these women. At the time, I subscribed to the cultural stereotype that had been part of even good true crime shows like The Wire, where they find a bunch of dead bodies and it propels the plot in motion. And we assume those people were trafficked and that we don't know their names and we'll never learn from them again. I assumed that these women lived off the grid, that they were outcasts from their families, that they were lost long before they were lost. But in fact, the only reason they were lost is because we decided they were lost. They had families, they had people who loved them, people who wanted the police to look for them when they went missing, people who were frustrated by the lack of efforts made by the police, people who had trouble even getting their names onto the registry of missing persons. And only when it became a big serial killer case did suddenly law enforcement have a vested interest in trying to solve their cases. It became interesting to me how wrong I was at first. And it became more interesting to me once I met the families, how much they had to talk about with one another. Not just about their lost loved ones and the lives that they led, but about the struggles that all of the families had faced. They all were from different towns within striking distance of New York, places like Portland, Maine, and Buffalo, New York, and Wilmington, North Carolina, Groton, Connecticut, and Jersey City, New Jersey. And these are all places that never really recovered from the big crash of 2008, places where people were still struggling, places where a young person didn't have the entry-level job opportunities that their parents or grandparents had. And it's a time where sex work is changing. You don't have to walk down the street. You don't have to be under the control of a pimp. You don't have to be a social outcast to be a sex worker. And if you work on Craigslist, you don't have to work full time. In fact, most people don't. And you can make far more money than you would make at the Dunkin' Donuts or at the Walmart. It's not even close. And time after time, as I researched these women's lives, I saw people who were experiencing economic shocks of a certain sort. Maybe they're facing eviction. And they see a way to make money quickly. They see it as a means for social mobility. To me, that is the opposite of the stereotype. To me, the stereotype is somebody who is leading a life of drug addiction or is traumatized from a life of abuse and falls into this work because they're desperate and addicted. If substances became a problem for some of these women, it happened later. It happened after. And that was interesting to me, too. And then abuse was way inconsistent. Some of them had been abused and then others had not, but their sisters had, and yet they were the ones who became escorts. I just became more and more interested in how surprising their lives were. And I thought this could be a potentially small but special book, a book that could come out with or without a killer. I was a little worried the publisher would force me to wait until there was a killer, but I was very pleased and grateful that my editors and my publisher, HarperCollins, they subscribed to the same idea I had, which was a sort of off the beaten path true crime book that was as much about the ways of life of all of the women and their families and the media maelstrom that engulfed them after the case happened, as it was about the search for the killer. And so I thought it would be a very small but potentially highly regarded book. And what surprised me was that within a year or two, unconventional, socially minded, high-minded true crime suddenly became everyone's favorite thing. Mm-hmm. Serial happened and Making a Murder happened. The Jinx happened. Streaming happened. And suddenly multi-part documentaries happened. And then finally podcasts happened. And to the extent that Lost Girls had a life for many years after it was published, it was because it hit that wave and rode that wave with so many other really excellent works of true crime. And I think that's why the movie got made, too, because it was time. The world was ready, particularly with Me Too. The world was ready for a story about listening to women, about women who had been forgotten.
It is a very sensitive portrait, and it definitely opened my eyes to what it is like for women who work as sex workers, because it isn't something that I had given a ton of thought to. But as I'm sitting here reading this, I'm going, wow, this is heartbreaking in a lot of ways. I really appreciated the sensitivity and the warmth that you gave to these women. And it's very clear that you spent a lot of time with the family members of the victims. Are you still close with them, especially now in light of the recent arrest? Are you still talking with them? Is this a relationship that you've continued to cultivate over the years?
There are a few who I'm send happy texts back and forth with over time. There are some who I haven't really seen since the Lost Girls movie came out, but I've just hit the like button when they've done something on Facebook. It was a horrible time in their lives when I was talking with them. And for some of them, talking with someone who wanted to write a book was the last thing they wanted to do after they had already taken time off from minimum wage jobs to go down to New York to be interviewed for 48 hours or Dateline. They didn't understand and didn't necessarily want to be a part of it. I traveled where they were. I tried to see them whenever I could. And I was witnessing them as the case was still fresh on Long Island, as there was news coming basically every day. And I was watching their reactions. And I think that that's a traumatic time for them. And I've been talking with law enforcement people recently since the arrest, and they've talked with some of these family members recently. And they talk about how they seem very normal until you start talking about the nitty gritty of the case. And then it's like a film covers over them and they stiffen up. And it's like they go back to that time when the case was fresh. So I'm not out barbecuing with them these days. No. Also, I appreciate what you said about the book's warmth and its compassion. It's a very tricky thing. Consider myself a traditional journalist, not an advocacy journalist. I didn't want to write a book that sort of turned these women into angels or carry the flag for them or to beat the drum and say, who will speak for these women? I will. I wanted to do a book that was anthropological, that kind of looked very carefully and sensitively at the lives these people led in perhaps a non-judgmental way, but not in a way that turned them into a different kind of trope, like the poor innocent babe in the woods who gets killed by a Hannibal Lecter monster. I didn't want to fall into that trap either. And I end up toward the end of Lost Girls just coming out and saying it, like they weren't angels and they weren't devils. They each got involved in escort work for different reasons, but they were deeply personal reasons to each of them. One of them wanted to win a way back into her family, and another one wanted to have a close relationship with her sister, and another was in love with her boyfriend and thought that they could build a family together with their money. Everybody's reasons were different.
When I read these sort of deep dives of the biographies of the women that you focus on, I do see a through line, though, of some terrible choices and drug addiction and abuse and even a mix of escort work with providing drugs, cocaine and other drugs to their johns. Don't you think that's part of the mix for a lot of these women?
The idea of being your own boss is attractive, and escort work puts you, for a brief period, it's occurred to me, as the center of attention. You're the star. And for someone leading an otherwise humdrum life where you're under it all the time, Maureen Brainard-Barnes in Connecticut, who always is having trouble paying the rent and is always having trouble keeping a job, to be able to go down to New York and stay in a hotel room and walk around Times Square and see the lights and then go see men who want to see her, who want to give her money. You can tell yourself a story. And I wanted to make sure that aspect of things really appeared in the book. With drugs, the bleakest story becomes Amber Costello, who really is a tragedy that began years before she even came to New York. Her parents essentially are deteriorating because of health problems stemming from their own addictions. All she has in life is her big sister, Kim. Kim is an escort. Amber becomes an escort. They travel together. They do everything together. And eventually addiction follows. By the time she's in Babylon, Long Island, the addiction is in full effect. She came to Long Island to go into rehab. Her sister paid for it, but then she came out, and the boyfriend who she met there, the two of them went right back into it. And so, yes, the sex work at that time is fully sustaining the drug habit. And there's really gruesome detail in Lost Girls about the lives that they were living in Long Island before she disappeared. And this gets so bleak that when she does disappear, no one, not even her sister, goes to the police because they don't think they'll be taken seriously, and also because they don't want to draw attention to the lives that they're leading. And that's as bad as bleak as it can get, it seems to me.
As the English teacher in the room, I do want to ask about your writing process, because I ask this of every author that we have on the pod, because I think that in some way it will probably help me teach my own students. Can you tell us a little bit about your writing process and how that process is informed by your vocation as a reporter?
I'd never written a book before, Lost Girls. I'd written magazine stories. Those stories, a lot of them were narrative in nature, and a lot of them involved interviewing people who were in difficult life situations and telling their stories. And I understood that to talk chronologically with those people was interesting and helpful. Didn't just help with writing, it also helped create a cogent way of thinking about their lives. And so I talked myself into thinking this would be easy. I thought this will be like 5 magazine stories about 5 women and their families, and then a 6th magazine story about the case, and bibbidi bobbidi boo, there'd be a book, maybe a small book, a very short book, then I would be done. And of course, it wasn't that easy. I had just enough of an advance to afford to take 6 months off of work from New York Magazine so I outcome proofed the book for myself. I said, even if the book sinks like a stone and nobody reads it, I won't have lost any money and I will have had a good experience working on something that I thought was interesting. So that's how I was able to go to sleep at night. For the first 6 months and the book was due in a year. So for 6 months, I stayed on the clock at New York Magazine. And I took little side trips here and there to all the hometowns, and I interviewed everybody I could, and I racked up hours and hours of audio. And I didn't really look at the audio. I had an extravagance, which is I paid to have all the audio transcribed because I thought that if I had to sit and transcribe it all, not only would it take a month, but also I probably wouldn't be the same person at the end of it, because I find it to be rather demoralizing to sit and listen to my own voice talking to people. So 6 months go by, and I have 6 months left before the book is ready, and I have all this transcribed interviews. And that's when the clock starts. That's when I take off work and I sit down and I created 6 buckets, one for each woman and her family and one for the investigation. And I looked at a calendar and I charted out how much time I would divide it up, how much time I would spend trying to write the sloppiest, worst possible draft version of each of these stories. And I went to work, and the time pressure kept me from stopping. My motto was, don't just keep going. So if I had a problem with a section, I would just make a little mark saying, you're going to have to come back to this, and then just kept going. Mm-hmm. But the real thing that kept me encouraged as I was working on it was that I already had an idea for what the book would look like. I was influenced by The Executioner's Song by Norman Mailer, which is really 2 books in one. I hear you say, the first part of the book is the prelude to the crime, and the second is the aftermath. And so I thought that would work here. You'd have a part 1 that is the lives of the women from the moment they are born to the moment that they disappear. And then part 2 would be everything that happened after their bodies were found. The blow by blow of the media maelstrom, the trauma of the families coming together and finding each other, the police dysfunction, the rumor mill, the conspiracy theories of who done it, and then finally, as an ending, where they all are now and how they look toward the future. And so I knew that it was going to look like that, and that kept me going as well. But as I wrote, I had lots of unanswered questions. I didn't know if I was writing a pulp detective book, like if I was writing an Elmore Leonard novel that was nonfiction, something grisly and tough, or if I was writing something intellectual and removed and anthropological, and that would read like a sociological study of these people. I didn't know which way I was going. I couldn't figure out what the voice was going to be. And so I decided to just hit the gas and be as explicit and tough as possible. And then I could always dial it back. And that's what I did. But somewhere in there was a second question I realized, which was, how on earth are you going to not just differentiate these women for readers, but lead the reader through and around these worlds? And so I had lots of chapters where I was the intermediary. Let's say a chapter begins, it's going to talk about Megan Waterman. The chapter begins with me saying, I'm sitting on a park bench talking to Megan Waterman's mother. It's been 6 months since her daughter's been found, and she lives in Portland, and this is what her life's in. This is the story she tells, things like that. That got me through the first draft. But then when I handed it in to my editors, they immediately said, you don't need to be in this book so much. Oh, and I immediately was relieved. I was so psyched, because what I said to them was, so you think I have enough? I have enough without me? They said, oh, yeah. You've learned enough about each of these women that you don't need to be in it. And that was extremely encouraging. And so the rewrite became about finding new ways to start those chapters.
So you then found yourself pulling back a little bit, and there wasn't so much of, I'm sitting here on a park bench on a sunny fall day or whatever.
Yeah, I was going in with the impression that the world I was describing was so alien to most readers that they would need someone to hold their hand and take them through it. But essentially what I learned was that wasn't necessary at all. And I was really happy about that. I am not the sort of magazine writer who puts myself in stories. And so it was an uncomfortable place to be in anyway. So I was like, great. I show up in the book at the moment that I show up in the chronology, when the case is, when the families have surfaced and the media is paying attention to them and somebody wants to get to know them better. That's when I am there as a fly on the wall. But you don't learn about me. I'm just part. That allows for scenes where it's just me and one person one-on-one talking about things, that allows for those scenes to appear in the book. But it's not like it's me as a character. It's me as an interviewer.
You didn't Truman Capote it.
Exactly.
I had the exact same thought. No,
but it really is just a wonderful piece of writing, honestly, Bob. It's amazing.
Well, thank you. I thought that the biggest challenge would be to try to understand women who I was never going to meet through the eyes of the people who knew them. Mm-hmm. And at first I thought it might not be possible, but then I realized that the women were in their 20s, that they weren't 16. They had lives independent of their families. And so I thought if I could talk to hopefully more than one, but at least one person who really knew them well in their adult lives, and I was lucky enough to talk to more than one for each of them, then I would have a fully dimensional view of who they were. And I decided that I would try to solve the answer of why did each of them become a sex worker? Why did they become an escort? Why did they make the decision that their cousin or their sister never did? What was it about it for them? And I had trouble finding the answer to that question for each of them, because even as I interviewed people who knew them well, at no point did any of those people say to me, and that's the day I remember that she looked at me and she said, you know what, I'm going to advertise on Craigslist. Mm-hmm. That just never happened. There was no moment where it happened. And so I changed the question. I realized that the way to understand anyone in fiction or in nonfiction is to find out what they want out of life, what they want. And so I sat down and I did some thinking based on all my interviewing. What does Maureen want? What does Megan want? What does Shannan want? What does Amber want? What does Melissa want? And what they wanted were all different things. I talked before about Shannan being alienated from her family and wanting to get back in. In the book, I talk about Melissa wanting to be successful and not to lead the life that her mother, who had her when she was 16, led. She came to New York for a whole different life. And Maureen wanted to pay for her rent so that she wouldn't be evicted, so that she could prove that she could have custody of her son. It goes on. And Amber wanted to be close to her sister, Kim, who I talked about a moment ago. Everybody had something different. And that suddenly was the key to understanding these people as individuals and not as plot devices in a true crime story.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. One process question. You're talking to a number of different people, and even listening to you describe the process, I get how you're talking about these women as younger, really girls growing up. Also talk to people that were more of their contemporaries, that were their friends, that were able to tell what they were up to pretty close to the moment they disappeared. Were any of these people resistant to the idea that you were going to plunk down a digital recorder and record the conversation? Did you encounter much resistance? Because some of this is A, painful, and B, some of these people are involved in illegal activity, particularly the friends and associates. Did anybody say, I don't want to be recorded, or you had to do the traditional reporter's notebook approach?
That's a very interesting question, because while it's certainly true that a lot of people resisted being interviewed at first, and I just kept asking and kept on moving through the book, and eventually through gentle, positive pressure, people agreed to be interviewed. But once I actually sat down to be interviewed, nobody flinched at the tape recorder. And that's something that I've noticed over the years. I first was a reporter working on news stories in like 1992 or 1993. And it was terrifying to take out a tape recorder, because you would think that the person would completely freak out and it would spoil the entire encounter. Quite often you wouldn't want to do it. You just sit there with your notebook. But the reality TV era has changed it all. It's changed everything. And I'm sure podcasting has changed it as well. It's a different time now, where I can't remember the last time someone has been upset about having a tape recorder out. In fact, they're upset if you don't. They're like, what? You're not going to record me? Because everybody thinks that they're going to get recorded. It's a night and day change. And of course, the other night and day change is that recording is so much easier now. You're not flipping tapes and buying new tapes, and God, it was horrible.
Changing batteries and the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, exactly. It was like the Stone Age.
Talk to us a little bit about Mary Gilbert and her murder at the hands of her daughter, Sarah. When and how did you hear about it, and what was your emotional response to it?
Such an awful turn of events, really a real tragedy. Most tragic of it all was that the life that Mary had been leading in the years since Shannan's death had really been in many ways the life that she had hoped to lead, an exemplary life where she was really caring for the people around her. That wasn't always the case with Mary. She was a really erratic person and had her own personal problems. I don't mean to be oblique here. I'm not talking about substances or anything like that, but just as a personality, she was a handful. But with her daughter, Sarah, she was a caregiver. She cared about her, and she cared about Sarah's son as well, who was in the mix. Sarah had mental health problems. Sarah had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and Sarah's mental health took a nosedive after Shannan's body was finally found. And her relationship completely disintegrated. She was on her own. She had psychotic breaks, more than one. She had meds that she was supposed to be on. There was a son that she was supposedly taking care of, and she was taking okay care of him. But she became more and more angry with her sister, Cherie, and also with Mary, particularly with Mary. And one day Mary came and visited and was murdered by Sarah. Sarah, you could say that she was psychotic. She also was planning it. So she ends up getting convicted of murder. The insanity defense doesn't work. It rarely works in the United States, actually, but it didn't work for her. So she's in prison now. And Mary is gone, and it's just awful. It was July. It was basically the same time of year as when I heard that Rex Heuermann had been arrested for the murders. So it was weird that way, like the same weather, the same like stuff I was doing outside. And the call came when I learned about Mary. I was really brought low, and immediately on the phone and Facebook and email and texting with everybody involved in the case. And at that point, actually, I was on the phone with Liz Garbus, too, the director of the Lost Girls movie, because even then she was trying to develop it as a movie. And she had met with Mary just a few months earlier and was ready to make a movie about Mary and her life. And suddenly Mary was gone. It was a real shock.
Something you highlight in the book, in the latter part of Lost Girls, you talk about the fact that Mary really seemed to find purpose in life following Shannan's disappearance and then ultimately her body being recovered. That seems to just make that losing her that much more profound a loss, I think, for all of us, because I don't think she had great purpose in her life prior to losing her daughter.
I think the best way of explaining this is to talk about the relationship with another daughter, Cherie, who, if you read Lost Girls, really is at odds with Mary toward the end. She's really angry with her, and Mary is alienating the people around her. It's a tough time, but also Cherie is upset with Mary for falling short in a lot of ways as a mother. I want to focus on that because that changed after Lost Girls came out. In the years before Mary's death, she mended fences with Cherie. She worked hard to take care of Sarah as well. And she worked hard to try to keep the police focused on Shannan's death and to get the 911 tape released and to get the second autopsy done and to get the remains away from the possession of the police department so that she could have a proper burial. She had real challenges toward the end of her life, and she was rising to those challenges and repairing her relationships with people. And that's the tragedy, I think.
So let's shift gears for a minute here. What would you say, especially given the fact that now we've finally seen an arrest in this case, what would you say were the biggest missteps in this case on the side of law enforcement and investigators? If you had to name the biggest couple, because it seems like there were a lot of missteps. What would you say some of the biggest ones were?
Before it was a serial killer case, the world we're in was a world where when these women were at risk in their lives, that nobody was really coming in to help them or support them. And when they disappeared, nobody was really working overtime to find them. If there finally was a murder case, suddenly the media was paying attention, but the police, some of them were resentful. They had inherited suddenly. It's like not just one cold case had crash landed in their backyard, 4 of them had. And then they found more bodies, 6 more bodies, 10 cold cases. And then the whole riddle of Shannan Gilbert, an 11th problem. They're sitting there with 11 problems, none of which they think are going to get solved anytime soon. And everybody's mad at them, and they've got other work to do, and they're annoyed. Part of this annoyance is apathy towards sex workers, and part of it is misogyny. And part of it is class, because God knows if these women had been high school cheerleaders or college students or workers in Manhattan who had gone missing, it would be a very different story. Lots of different pressure involved to try to solve the case. In terms of police work, it wasn't just apathy or misogyny. There was a tip that we now know about, a witness statement that somebody who saw an individual and a car the night before Amber Costello disappeared, someone who was big enough to look like an ogre and who drove a car that looked like a Chevy Avalanche. This tip went nowhere early on, and then it sat in the case file. No one worked on it at all. No one talked about it at all for more than 10 years until a year ago. And then suddenly it pinpointed our suspect. If that tip had gone somewhere 12 years ago, then they would have had that suspect that much sooner. There was resistance to innovation. There was cell tower technology where they could have tried to match up the movements of the various burner phones that were used to contact the women. This, to me, I would think would be the first thing you would want to do in a case that's based on technology, like a Craigslist case. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to do it. They were resistant to it. The FBI offered help to expand their work that they had done early on in it, and the Suffolk County authorities resisted it. They wanted to do their own thing. To complete my list, which is already a really long list, there's corruption. There's police corruption, because at the beginning of 2012, in comes a new chief of department in the Suffolk County Police Department, a guy named Jim Burke, who is a known quantity, a problematic figure for years. He had been working for the DA, and now he was over in the police force again after being away. And he turned the place into the KGB. He had people followed. He had people wiretapped. He went after his enemies. He beat up a witness and then tried to cover it up. It was a misery. For 4 years, he was involved in the department, and it was just a shocker there that happened. But the shocker for the Gilgo Beach case is that he kept the FBI away, that the FBI was there ready to do work, and he didn't want the FBI looking over his shoulder, so he kept them away.
The lack of cooperation, particularly with the FBI, and I don't mean to attribute the recent success with the arrest of Rex Heuermann strictly to the FBI, but it's pretty striking that 6 weeks or so after a new task force is formed with a high level of cooperation between Suffolk County, New York State Police, FBI, and other agencies, it can't be lost on anybody that 6 weeks after this new team, energized, working together, cooperating, they're all of a sudden making progress, significant progress, including the tip regarding the so-called ogre and the Chevy Avalanche. He was a very distinctive physical figure, and the truck was a very unique vehicle. And they knew they should be looking for that truck and that individual in Massapequa or Massapequa Park. Once they actually put the team together that weren't playing politics and weren't covering up corruption, the case started moving forward.
I think that's accurate. I'm starting to get a more detailed view of how that went down. The corruption ended a couple of years before this new administration came in. There was an interim period where they did do some significant work on the cell tower stuff, and they even limited the area even better, and they had an even more narrow list of possible homes where a killer might live. They still didn't have a suspect, though, and that's because it's not just that nobody was acting on the tip about the Chevy Avalanche. It's that people didn't even know it existed anymore. It had disappeared into the case file. The file wasn't even searchable. It wasn't digitizable. At the beginning of 2022, there's a new police commissioner, Rodney Harrison, and there's a new district attorney, Ray Tierney, and they both have done work in New York, and they both worked on gang cases, and they both understood how important cell tower technology is because it puts people in places without needing witness statements. And so they're ready for a task force. And it's not just the FBI that helps, it's the state police as well, state troopers. And it's a state trooper on the task force who does a different kind of search for the Chevy Avalanche that turns up a guy, Rex Heuermann, who's huge like an ogre, who lives in Massapequa Park and, not incidentally, has 97 gun permits. So it suddenly becomes someone they can look at. They don't just have all this cell tower data, which they've assembled in recent years. Now they have somebody to square it against. But it is amazing, as you said. The task force began February 1st, I believe, 2022. And I think they found the Chevy Avalanche attached to Heuermann on March 14th. So no time at all.
about 6 weeks, I think, from the time they got started, just after the beginning of the year. Credit to everybody who worked on this thing, but of course, it was all sitting there waiting to be discovered. I know we hear a lot of cliches about fresh eyes, but I think fresh eyes, fresh enthusiasm, a new team, with all this talent, 6 weeks later, they've actually got strong leads, which led them directly to a suspect.
Yeah, and I think there's a frustration there among some of the people who immediately preceded this group, because they did some good things too. They identified an additional victim, Valerie Mack, who had been anonymous up till then, and gave her family information that they sorely wanted for years, and they made pieces of evidence public, and there were things they did. And as I said, they refined the geographic area where cell signals were pinging, and there was hope, but there was no suspect. The suspects that they were going after, none of them panned out. And you can't have one without the other.
So when the arrest was made back in July, what was your response? Was Rex Heuermann in any way what you expected when you pictured the perpetrator in these cases?
When I learned that he lived in Massapequa Park and commuted to Manhattan, I thought that certainly fits. But when I learned that he had a family, that surprised me. And when I learned that he had a public-facing job where he wasn't a landscaper or gardener like Joel Rifkin. He wasn't bopping around in his truck, not talking to anyone all day long. He actually talked to people and had to impress them and went over their business. And some of these people were powerful people in New York City that he had to be a consultant for. I wasn't expecting that. And it's not like he was some super charmer like a Ted Bundy figure. But he was public. He was gregarious and ambitious. And then he went home and had a wife and 2 children. At first you wonder, how do you find the time? How do you manage a life to be able to do this? And then you think, clearly, he found a way. And then you learn about a vault down in his house with not just 97 guns, but 280 guns. And it starts to become something really gothic going on there in that house.
The $64,000 question may be, do you think that Rex Heuermann is responsible for the other victims in the Long Island serial killings?
I'd like to give you an answer, but I need 1 second. The dog here is eating a napkin. Hang on.
Hold on. Bob went under the table for a second, and I was like, I don't know what's going on there, but we'll give it a second.
I actually saw that beautiful dog.
Oh, I didn't see the dog.
And now I saw the dog in the background, and I was like, I think he just grabbed something off the counter.
Oh,
like,
really?
I thought I saw it, and I was like, did I?
Oh,
I'm not sure.
I'm not always looking at the screen. Of course, I'm looking at the questions and other things.
I think it's grabbing something off the counter. Oh, no.
That's funny. That it was in the background.
We'll take that part out.
Yeah.
All right. So you had asked about more. So I think that's a great question. One of the first things I certainly thought was, how does somebody who apparently is responsible for 3 or 4 women on the beach continue to live his life for another 12 years after those bodies are discovered? How does that person not try something else, not hurt someone else? How does he just stop? And I think it's going to be pretty dreadful to learn exactly what kind of life he was leading in that time. And before that time, was this his first? Was Maureen Brainard-Barnes in 2007 really his first victim? That we have a lot left to learn about him. I'm no profiler, but it seems odd to me that he would stop being interested in this sort of thing and just turn it off.
When you finished your book and turned it in, that is the first edition of the book, because now you've added an afterword. Did you think someday I think this case is going to be solved, or did you always think it was going to remain as a terrible unsolved part of Long Island history?
I had really placed myself in the lane of focusing on the victims. In fact, I started to get to a place where I thought our culture thinks too much about Hannibal Lecter. I enjoyed The Silence of the Lambs as much as anyone. That between that and Dexter and everything else, like we sit and romanticize these people, and that they're all like Joel Rifkin. They're just disturbed, gross people who need to be put away. But I'm not going to think about it. And I had skepticism about whether the Long Island authorities would ever have any headway. The only silver lining I thought of at the time over the years was that a lot of these cases do tend to get solved 10 or 15 years later. Mm-hmm. All over the country, you hear about it 10 or 15 years later. Something shakes loose. Somebody's life situation changes. They tick somebody off. They die, or a witness suddenly changes their mind. something happens. And that, I think that's in fact really what happened here. Administration changed and the corrupt culture started to wither away. And suddenly there was cooperation with other agencies. That's what changed in this case.
What is next for you in terms of projects? I know you've had a lot of success with Lost Girls. You had a ton of success too with Hidden Valley Road, which actually is in my classroom at this very moment on my bookshelf. So what's next? What else? When else can I put another Robert Kolker book on my shelf?
I would love to write another book. At the moment, I have a lot of magazine work going. The books are always really big gambles, and I need to do what I did with Lost Girls, which is outcome proof them in my head, think this will be worth putting a couple of years into. And so it's tricky. I usually have to kiss a lot of frogs before finding another book. But in the meantime, I just handed in a draft of a New York Times Magazine story about the Gilgo case to try and chime in with the rest of the world. Perhaps that'll be the last thing I do in it, perhaps not. And then I'm thrilled to have a nice relationship with the Times Magazine now where I can write about any number of different subjects. I've written about a plagiarism case and about a family with dementia. It's a thrilling career where I can have a lot of variety and jump around, but I do keep coming back to families. I do end up writing about families in crisis, families facing challenges. I did it with Lost Girls and with my other book as well. And so I imagine it's going to take me somewhere new before long.
Do your publishers and editors call you up and say, gee, Bob, it would be great if you wrote another book? Or
I think I'm feeling the pressure more than they're like, you can't hurry love. They get it. They understand that it has to be a good idea too. So they've seen it before, that it takes some time.
Do you know roughly when your New York Times Magazine article will appear?
I don't, but I assume it'll be sometime in late September or in the month of October. It won't sit around for long. So it's not going to wait until the trial or anything like that.
So fall 2023. It's coming soon, we hope.
Yeah, I hope so.
And then is Hidden Valley Road getting the Netflix treatment, or is that one going to remain purely in book form?
It was in development for a while, and that one, I wasn't creatively involved in the Lost Girls movie, but I was with developing a Hidden Valley Road miniseries, and I really enjoyed working on it. I really grew and developed as a writer, trying to work with a screenwriter. It was really a thrill for me. And at the moment, it hasn't been picked up. These things go up and down and have different lives. Lost Girls went to 3 different studios before Netflix finally made it. You got to kind of divorce myself from the outcome with that one and hope for the best.
The book is Lost Girls, an Unsolved American Mystery. And where can our listeners look for this amazing book?
Lost Girls is still in print, which means it's everywhere. You could buy it on the internet or you could buy it in your bookstore. And it does have an afterword about Mary Gilbert. And perhaps one day when the case against Rex Heuermann proceeds in court, there'll be another.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Mind Over Murder. We've really appreciated talking to you.
I really like talking with you guys. Thanks so much.
That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.